So here's, I think, Aristotle's best argument for why he thinks that, maybe the fundamentals of the argument for why he believes that the life of contemplation is the ergon, the function of human beings, and therefore the thing that they need to do in order to be truly happy, true happiness, full happiness, happiness in the most exemplary way. This is in section 7 again. This is where he introduces the idea of the function, the ergon, the what it was meant to do for human beings. Again, in section 7, in this paragraph right here that begins, presumably, it bears some careful study. Let's read it through. Presumably, however, to say that happiness is the chief good seems a platitude, and a clearer account of what it is still desired. Excuse me. This might perhaps be given if we could first ascertain the function of man. For just as for a flute player, a sculptor, or an artist, and in general, for all things that have a function or activity, the good and the well is thought to reside in the function. So it would seem to be for man, if he has a function. I mean, that's the huge question, right? If you read Sartre's Existentialism is a Humanism, it's all about denying that human beings have a function and then sort of saying what the implications of that are. But traditionally, in classical thought and Judeo-Christian thought, it was thought that human beings did have a function, and Aristotle believes that human beings do. Have the carpenter then and the tanner certain functions or activities, and has man none? Is he born without a function? Or, as eye, hand, foot, and in general, each of the parts evidently has a function, may one lay it down that man similarly has a function apart from all these? What then can this be? Okay, so this is the point at which I said, in which ethics demands a theory of human nature. If we're going to say what the good or the function is for a living thing, that is, what it needs to be doing to make itself happy, then we have to have some notion of what it is, of its nature. And this is where he gives it. He says, life seems to be common even to plants, but we are seeking what is peculiar to man. Let us exclude, therefore, the life of nutrition and growth. So, okay, let's look at human beings. What are their general characteristics? That'll help us in our search for their ergon, their function. Well, the first thing we notice about human beings is they are living things. So maybe the ergon is just to be alive. Maybe their proper function is just to live. But it's too general. Life is common even to plants. It's not distinctive enough. It doesn't get to the human essence. Yes, we are alive, but that just to say that we are living things is much too broad a statement. We need something more concrete. Let us exclude, therefore, the life of nutrition and growth. And I'm right here. Next, there would be a life of perception, but it also seems to be common, even to the horse, ox, and every animal. So maybe the second thing we notice about human beings, is beyond the bare fact that they're alive, is that they perceive, they are conscious, unlike plants. So maybe the ergon is just to be conscious, to perceive things. But again, this is too general, right? Because this covers all animals. It's not distinctive enough. It doesn't really help us in our search for the ergon. So he continues, and I'm right here. There remains then an active life of the element that has a rational principle. Okay. So here we are We have gone through the more general characteristics of human beings to the particular one that is distinctive, definitive of human beings, that human beings are rational creatures, that there's a part of us, not every part of us, right, but there is a part of us that has a rational principle. That what is distinctive of human beings is not that they are alive or that they have sense perception, but rather that they have a rational part of themselves, a part that can think and reason. But this is a complex thing. You can't simply say that human beings have a rational part, because this rational part, and this is important for the rest of the book, which we don't have to go into, but if you're interested in reading the rest of the ethics, that this rational part also can be broken down. He says of this rational element, one part has such a principle, a rational principle, in the sense of being obedient to one, the other in the sense of possessing one and exercising thought. Human beings can be thought of, roughly speaking, as consisting of both body and mind, or of both thinking and desire. And the part of us that is most fully rational is this one, he says, that has the rational principle in the sense of possessing one and exercising thought. But there's another part of us which is not actively thinking, but has such a rational principle in the sense of being obedient to one. And that's about really a very important part of this book that we can't get into, but developing the right habits. He continues and says, and as life of the rational element also has two meanings, we must state that life in the sense of activity is what we mean, for this seems to be the more proper sense of the term. Now, if the function of man, okay, here it is. If the function of man is an activity of soul which follows or implies a rational principle, okay. So it gets complicated, but there he's basically said it. What is the function of man? Well, that is the ergon, the thing that human beings are meant to do. Well, an activity of soul which follows or implies a rational principle, which can mean a lot of different things. But what is distinctive about a human being is that they can think. What's distinctive about a human being is that they are rational, that they have the power of reason. If we look at all the things that exist in the universe, and then we look at all the living things that exist on Earth, we are unique in that way. So that when I said that, these other things that we're talking about, tools, the simpler animals, that they had an ergon or function, well, they certainly, we hate to see it, but sometimes animals are paraded in front of us doing silly things, like in the old days, teaching the chimpanzee how to smoke a cigarette, which I hope you've never seen, but there are probably videos on YouTube. I mean, that's just wrong, right? I mean, a chimpanzee, it can smoke a cigarette, but it shouldn't. It's not meant to. It's meant to do other things which are in accord with its nature. So we human beings are complex creatures who can do all sorts of things, but what we're meant to do is think. Now, exactly what that means? Well, thinking doesn't take one form, and being rational doesn't mean just one thing. But if we're not living a life that's a thinking life, if we're not living a life which is a life in which we are exercising our rational capabilities, then we're kind of like the chimpanzee. We're doing other things that we can do, but we're missing the one thing that we should do. Let's just end the paragraph here. And he says, and if we say, and I'm right here, and if we say so-and-so and a good so-and-so have a function which is the same in kind, for example, a liar and a good lyre player, and so without qualification in all cases, eminence in respective goodness being added to the name of the function. For the function of a lyre player is to play the lyre, and that of a good lyre player is to do so well. If this is the case, and we state the function of man to be a certain kind of life, and this to be an activity or actions of the soul, implying a rational principle, and the function of a good man to be the good and noble performance of these, and if any action is well performed when it is performed in accordance with the appropriate excellence, if this is the case, the human good turns out to be activity of soul in accordance with virtue, and if there are more than one virtue, in accordance with the best and most complete. Now, that is a very long and complex sentence. I'm sure it's worse in Greek. It's even horrible in English, but he's, again, this is an introduction to a much longer book in which he'll be exploring ethics and the central idea of the virtues and what the different virtues are, basically spelling out in detail what it means to live a good life. But I'd just like to go back to just the idea of this. The function of man is an activity of soul which follows or implies a rational principle. Again, there are all sorts of different ways of being rational. One way is to become a theoretical physicist and devote your life to thinking. Another way is just thinking about your life, more humble way that is more common to us, to me. That is, he's saying something there which is not so different from what Socrates said in the Apology, when he said that the unexamined life is not worth living. In fact, in a certain way, Aristotle is expressing the very same thought. That true happiness is doing what we're meant to do as human beings. And although it's not clear really what we were meant to do with our lives, one thing we do know is that we're meant to think, that we have this incredible capacity for reasoning, for reflection, for philosophy, that we don't just live, we think about how we live. And we don't just live, we think about how we could live well, how we could live better than we do, how we could all live better than we do. It's fundamental to a human life on the individual level. It's fundamental to the life on a political level, the communal level. How can we build a better society? We think about these things. We don't just, most of us, I hope, don't just say, well, this is the way the world is and the way this is. We think about how it could be better, just like we think about how we could be better. Well, that's using your reason. That's being rational. Now, ultimately, he will say that the life devoted to the acquisition of knowledge and understanding, what he would think of as the philosopher's life. We may think of it more widely as the intellectual life, whether it's philosophy or science or literature, history, the study of life of study. He will argue that that is, at the end of the day, the most pleasurable life for the very reasons that he's laid out here, because it's the life that is exercising the most essential part of human nature, the rational part. But most of us don't live lives that are devoted in that way. It's always going to be a minority of people who live that sort of overwhelmingly contemplative life. But each one of us tries to live a rational life, to not just live, but to think about how we should live. And that is using our reason. So ultimately, you get a kind of a sketch of what he's getting at here in the introduction. That the search is for the greatest good. The greatest good is happiness, and the greatest happiness, the true happiness for a human being, is doing what they were meant to do, to actually actualizing their potential, their ergon, their function. And however rough a sketch it may be, that has to have something to do with reason, because we are essentially, and this will come up later in the course, thinking creatures.